That's good. So this is the way that his son was brought up, and he had teachers, but the teachers found that the son was brilliant, and there was a point where it was hard for them to teach him anything. Like he mastered numbers, he knew the names of all the numbers. They had a whole system of enumerating things like even large numbers, like the number of grains of sand in the Ganges River basin. They had a name for that number, and so on. And he knew. He just had learned all of those numbers. He knew the names of all the different lengths, um, like the length of a louse seed, the length of the waist of a wasp. These There were all names for these things, including the length of a yojana, which is like 20 miles long, things like that. He learned all of that, and could recite them easily. And one story from when he was young, and to just describe kind of his heart and how sensitive he was. He had a cousin named Devadatta who was a good archer. And one day, some large birds, I believe they were swans, were flying overhead. And the prince was noticing them. And then an arrow went up and hit one of the swans in the wing, so that swan came down. And it came down in his garden, and so he went and cared for it, and took out the arrow and ministered to the wound. And then a servant of Devadatta came and said, "I'm here to collect my master's bird." And the young prince, he was known as Siddhartha. Young Prince Siddhartha said, "You can't have it." And so then his cousin Devadatta came and said, "That's mine. I'm the one who shot it down. Otherwise, it would be flying away. The only reason it's here in your garden is because I shot it, so it's mine." And and the prince said, "No, no, I don't think you can have this bird because you're taking its life, whereas I'm giving it life. So I'm the one, the best owner of this bird. It's not dead; it's still alive." And so the king had his ministers debate on which argument was the strongest one, and his son won out. And so it was like that. He was very sensitive and kind to people, to animals, very good heart. And in his, I think when he was something like, yeah, when he was a teenager, his father had taken him out in the spring, to see the planting of the fields, and to give his son a sense of what was going on in the kingdom at that time. And his son saw so they would be plowing the fields. So the farmers would be working hard, sweating. The oxen, which would be pulling the plows, would be also exerting themselves. Um, Worms and other insects would be killed as a result of the plow, and and he was troubled by all of this that he saw, and he sat down beside a field under a tree and contemplated that. And it said that he reached a deep state of concentration, thinking about all of these difficulties that living beings were experiencing in order to survive. And so his father found him like that and brought him home, and was a bit disturbed. And he brought his ministers again to say, well, I think my son is might be going in the direction of sainthood now, so we have to find a solution. So the ministers suggested that his father find Siddhartha a wife. And so the father sent word out that his son was eligible and seeking a wife to wed. And all of these different young women showed up and introduced themselves. And the prince was friendly, but didn't show any particular strong attraction to any of them, except for one. Yasodhara was her name. And the ministers noticed this. So they said to the father, it's Yasodhara has definitely caused a strong interest in your son, so you should contact her father and arrange a wedding. So that's what the father did. But Yasodhara's father um, was hesitant because he had heard of Siddhartha, and he was kind of a very protected prince. And in those days, kings wanted their sons to be, strong and master of the arts of war, things like this. The Indian culture, they had lots of small kings, and they waged war on each other all the time. And if you recall from history, it was an Indian arrow that struck Alexander the Great and discouraged him from going any further into India and returning back towards Greece. And that wound eventually killed him. Of course, Alexander was thinking that he would be the master of the world, but he never was finding the end of the world. And then after he crossed the the mountain range, the Hindu Kush, from Afghanistan into at that time it was India still. Now it's Pakistan. Then he found like one city state after the other, and they were all well armed, well trained soldiers. He's that this is enough. So that's the way it was. And so Yasodhara's father, and also Yasodhara herself, mentioned that she would have to have a competition for her hand. And Siddhartha's father was worried because his son was so pampered, and that how was he going to compete against these other princes who were all trained in the arts of war and the like. So, and also Yasodhara was a bit disturbed because she was also attracted to the prince, and the prince Siddhartha was not worried at all. He says, "No problem, I'll compete with them." And so he did, and he like for instance his cousin Devadatta was famous as an archer, and so there the princes would line up targets and try to hit them, and Devadatta would line up his target further away than all the rest of them, and he would hit his target. And then Siddhartha put his target even further away, and then asked for his bow. And then he made this statement that really puzzled people. He said that to win Yasodhara's favor, I feel I should have a better bow than this. And there was this one famous bow that the Sakyas, the Shakya clan, they had some hero that and the hero's bow was still existing, so they brought it. And nobody had been able to string this bow since the day of that hero. But Siddhartha was able to string it, and he shot his arrow, and it went so true, hit the target, but went right through it. So strong the bow was. And then he had to master, well, they had a horse racing contest, and Siddhartha's horse was the fastest. And they had a number of these competitions. And of course, Siddhartha's father was so happy, he had no idea that his son had these capabilities. And Yasodhara was also very happy. And so it was decided that the two of them would get married, and they lived in these great mansions with incredible staff, moving place to place as the climate changed. So at some point, Siddhartha thought that he should see what his kingdom was like, and go outside the gates of these properties where he was living. And he had to ask his father permission because the gates were closed, and his son, so that his son wouldn't escape. So in a way, it was like he was imprisoned, but it was like a beautiful prison. And so his father agreed and thought this was a good idea for his son to go out and meet the people. But he said that, so he sent word to the city of Kapilavastu that people should decorate the houses, the streets to welcome their prince, and that nobody who is old or sick should be out on the street. They should be hidden. So then the prince rode on the chariot, his chariot, into and had a charioteer who was steering the horses, and the prince would be there, and people celebrated seeing him, and apparently he was very handsome and tall. And there was one, there was a story where one of the women who had come out on her porch and saw the prince, and made this statement that his wife must be in nirvana. So the term nirvana meant peaceful and satisfied, right, and where it was normally used. It later became a term to describe the Buddha's achievement of enlightenment, or liberation from suffering and the cause of suffering. It's also called nirvana. So anyway, so the prince goes into the city on his chariot, sees all the people, they're all cheering and welcoming him. And somehow an a very old person showed up on the streets. Then Siddhartha saw this person, bent over, drooling from the mouth, no hair on his head, having to support himself with a cane, barely able to walk. And Siddhartha asked his chariot driver, said, "What's that?" And the chariot driver told him, "That's an old person." And he said, "An old person? Are there more of them?" The charioteer says, "We'll all become old persons just like that. You'll become old like that. Your father will become old like that. Your wife, Yasodhara, will become old like that. I'll become old like that. Everybody will become old like that." And that shocked the prince. He just didn't know that that existed. He'd never seen it before. He didn't know that that was part of what everybody would have to go through. And so he wanted to go back to the palace and consider this. So that's, and when he went back to the palace, then of course all the dancers, the musicians, everything were instructed to try to distract him from this mood that he had fallen into. And so it went for a time like that, and then he wanted to go back again to the city. And this happened a few times, and each time he went uh, against the instructions of his father, he saw something he wasn't supposed to see. The next time he saw somebody who was ill, very ill, in pain from their illness, and asked his charioteer, "What was that?" "Oh, that's somebody who's ill," and discovered that everybody gets ill and that he could expect to get ill and that his father would get ill and his wife would get ill. And it's something that it's unavoidable. And so he'd return back to the palace after seeing something like that and contemplate it, then get distracted, and then want to go back to the city again. And the third time he went back, he saw a corpse. And this really troubled him when he discovered that everybody was going to die. And that's something that nobody escapes from. And he couldn't believe that people could just conduct their lives uh, in an ordinary way as if that was not their fate. Because from his point of view, that was shock, incredible shock that we're all going to die one day. So, and one of his trips, he saw a mendicant, a yogi. In India, they call them sadhus, who was sitting under a tree meditating. And he asked his charioteer, "Who is that? What's he doing? He looks very peaceful." And then his charioteer told him about mendicants and how they practice meditation and how they're interested in trying to find a escape from all of the terrors of life. And so the Prince Siddhartha then learned that there was people who did make an effort to try to find some solution to this. So he asked his father if he could leave the mansion and to go in search of teachers who could teach him how to meditate and find. And his father said, "No, I'm not going to let you do that. And I want you to uh, take over my position." And Siddhartha said to him, "Well, I would be happy to if you can show me a way to escape aging, sickness, and death." And his father said, "I'm sorry, I can't do that, but I'm not going to let you go." And so then Siddhartha planned his escape. And so one night he got his charioteer to set up, put the rigging on the horse, and somehow all the guards were sleeping. They were able uh, to open the gates without making any noise. And they went out. And when they reached this one forest, then the prince, took his sword and cut his hair off, um, took off his robes and put on these castaway kind of clothes that he found. And the robes could be given away, and told the charioteer not to let anybody know where he went, but that he was going to try to find a solution to these sufferings of aging, sickness, and death. And when he found them, he would return. So then he started, so that was called the Great Renunciation. And he uh, walked to an area around the capital city of Rajgir. Rajgir was the capital city of a area in India called Magadha, the central kingdom. And the higher king, Bimbisara, was the ruler and lived in Rajgir. And around Rajgir are five different uh, mountains. And so he found meditators there, and so he studied with them and would go into the city occasionally to get to beg for alms. And, uh, and and when he would arrive, people were quite startled by him because he had this magnificent kind of bearing, tall, handsome. He looked very different from the other meditators, and they would kind of fall over themselves to offer him food, things like this. And one day, the king heard about this, and so he went to see this young yogi and would talk to him and learned that he was from the same caste as himself, the warrior caste, which at that time in India was the most prominent. Generally, the Brahmin caste was considered the highest caste, and they were responsible for all of the conducting rituals, things like that. And there are certain diets that they would keep and certain activities they would not engage in. But this was a degenerate time where the warrior caste was considered to be more influential, more powerful, more respectable than even the Brahmin caste. So Bimbisara invited him to join him to share his kingdom, to that Bimbisara would find him a wife and could live in his palace and all this. And Prince Siddhartha said that he'd already had all of that and had given it up, and he was in search of something uh, to find a solution to this condition of aging, sickness, and death. So from that area, he walked to the area near uh, Bodh Gaya, which is south of Rajgir, and there he joined five other ascetics who were engaged in different kinds of practices of austerity, such as fasting, kind of thing. And so Prince Siddhartha engaged in that as well and demonstrated much more resolve than even those five. So the five became students of his. They were inspired by him. And he practiced these austerities for 6 years. He had different teachers who taught him how to gain deep states of concentration, but he didn't find that those states of concentration were uh, going to solve the problem that he was dealing with of aging, sickness, and death. He didn't think that no matter how deep a concentration was that he achieved, he still knew that he would eventually be reborn again and then have to suffer aging, sickness, and death, and then be reborn again, and on and on and on. So that was not a solution, but it nonetheless was useful for when you can sit for as many hours as you want in complete concentration, focused on any object you chose. So it was definitely a useful tool. And uh, he got so that he would just eat like one pea a day, and so he became very, very thin, and he lost this great beauty of the body that he had, and one day, while he was meditating by this river, he got up to get a drink and fainted and collapsed into the river, just the edge of the river. It was moving very slowly, but it was hard for him to get out of it. He was so weak, but fortunately there was a branch that he could pull himself out, and he decided that this extreme asceticism that he was practicing was going to kill him before he found what he was looking for. So fortunately, there was this woman who was on her way to make an offering at this one shrine that she had prayed to. Uh, and she had prayed to this shrine many times because she had married and it was difficult for her and her husband to have a child. So she prayed at this shrine to have a child. And eventually she had a child and she was so happy to have a child. And then she wanted to make a special offering at that shrine in thanksgiving for having conceived and had the beautiful baby boy that she carried with her. And the offering that she had was an offering of like yogurt and rice, or a sweet rice like that. But in any case, the milk of 100 cows was fed to 50 cows, and their milk was fed to 24 cows, and their milk was fed to 6 cows, and their milk was used to make this yogurt. And the rice, each grain that was planted into a sprout and then planted was specially chosen, planted in the best ground that her husband owned, producing the best rice that they could possibly produce. It was cooked, then mixed with this milk or yogurt, and that's what she was offering or taking to offer. But when she saw the condition of this yogi, and he had asked her if she had any food that she could give him, she thought, I'm going to give it to him because he really needs it. And it had a great effect on him. This food was just right for his body, and uh, and so he ate it and felt much better. And meanwhile, the other 5 ascetics saw him talking to this young woman and eating, and they said, "Ah, Siddhartha's abandoned the practice. We'll never talk to him again." And so they left. And then Siddhartha decided, now is the time while I have strength from this wonderful meal. I'm There's no other teachers around who can teach me what I'm trying to learn. I am, and so he sat down under this tree and said, I'm not going to get up until I find what I'm looking for. So that night, um, things started to happen. Not only in his meditation, there's this story that this god of desire, the god of desire realm, was upset to see this yogi who was about to pass beyond his realm, and thought, I have to stop this yogi from doing that. And so wind started to howl, and storm clouds formed, and lightning and thunder, and all of this kind of stuff to try to dissuade the yogi from meditating. And none of that worked. So then this god of the desire realm called Mara, he sent he sent what he referred to as his daughters. I think one was called lust, the other one was called doubt. I forget their names, but he sent his daughters to try to distract the yogi from, and the yogi would not be distracted at all. And then Mara said, well, I I know how I got to be a god. It was through a practice of generosity where I gave something and kept my mind open to continue to give instead of thinking, I'm giving you this now, but don't ask me again. Instead of thinking like that, he had the thought of generosity. Well, and continuing to give. What again? I continue to give. And because of that good deed, he was born as this god of the desire realm. And then he said to the prince, he said, but who's going to know what you achieve? They're trying to catch him in a moment of egotism, right? And so and then the prince uh, put his hand on his knee and with his fingers touching the ground below him, just like this first statue. It's a famous pose of the Buddha. And the earth shook, and the earth goddess arose from the earth and said, we have watched this person in lifetime after lifetime engaging in virtue. The earth will be the witness of his accomplishment. So then Mara left, defeated. So then he went deeper into meditation and he saw innumerable uh, examples of his former lifetimes, things that he did, um, names that he had, innumerable, how he arose, acted, died, reborn, engaged in various activities, died, reborn, on and on and on and on and on. And after that, he started to put together um, characteristics of all of those rebirths and saw how, due to ignorance, he didn't know that how he viewed himself and others was there was a fault to that, attributing a level of reality to himself and others that was not really there. And that based on that, would engage in activities that would then continue to um, support such an illusion. And due to those activities, that birth would take place. And through birth, a body would form, sense organs would develop, and through sense organs, one would make contact with the object of the senses. And if there was a pleasant experience, then one would become attached to that object that produced a pleasant experience, such that one would not want to be separated from it. If there was an unpleasant experience, then one would become attached to being free from that, to find some freedom from continued contact with what was unpleasant. And then with regard to this clinging attachment to what was pleasant, there would also be a clinging attachment for continued existence. And that this would arise, this attachment would arise especially at the time of death, when there was the notion that one would cease existing, that it was hard to bear that thought, and that this clinging to continued existence would arise, and that this would become a cooperative condition for some impetus in his mind left from having engaged in an action under the illusion of existing in a certain way that was not as real as thought. And so that impetus would ripen and then throw him into another life in which there would be birth, aging, and death. And so he thought, It's this ignorance that is the root of all of this problem. And he penetrated that and saw that uh, he saw the illusion. What he had taken to be real was, in fact, an illusion. And he had the thought that now I have discovered the builder of this prison, and this builder will build no more. And by dawn, he had achieved what was called enlightenment. So when he came out of that meditation, he stayed in that area for a month or so. And during that time, he was wondering, who could I teach this to? He thought, this is pretty subtle. Who could I teach this to? And he was approached and requested to teach because there were those who had just a very small, thin veil of ignorance, and they, with their intelligence, could learn what he was teaching, what he had to teach. So he thought maybe those five ascetics that had followed him in the past, maybe they would be the suitable disciples. And they were in a place called the Deer Park uh, outside of Sarnath, which is an area, town near the city of Varanasi in India. So he walked there, and those five ascetics were practicing asceticism in the Deer Park. They saw him coming, and they said, well, no, we're not going to talk to him, but we'll put a mat out for him to sit on because they were raised as gentlemen. So they put a mat out, and then when he got closer, uh, he was just irresistible the way he looked. So they asked him, what did you do? What happened to you? And then he started to teach them. And so what he taught them was the Four Noble Truths. That's what it's usually called, but it's the Four Truths of Nobles would be more accurate. And nobles is a translation of the term Arya, and so those are the Aryan tribes came from Central Asia and came into India and took control over it. So they regarded themselves as, special. They became the aristocrats, kind of the nobles. So that's why it's translated that way. But it also has the sense of being kind of superior. And so superior in a spiritual sense, the same term is used for those who are able to overcome this ignorance, which is a misconception, a misapprehending oneself and others uh, in a way that they don't exist. So somebody who has the direct experience of that is also called an Arya. So he taught them these four truths. And it's the truth of suffering, the truth of the origin of suffering, the truth of the cessation of the origin and suffering, and the truth of the path leading to cessation. So it's like two sets of cause and effect. The cause and effect that keep one imprisoned in this cyclic existence of death and rebirth, and the cause and effect of the liberation from that vicious circle of death and rebirth. So the truth of suffering is that that this body and mind is impermanent. That this body and mind suffers. that this body and mind is not as pure as we think, and that there's no permanent self existing in this complex of body and mind or separate from it. And so the idea that it is impermanent is to remove the view that we're permanent, and sometimes, although nobody would admit to being permanent, the way we act is often makes it seem as if we believe that we're permanent. Uh, like the way we plan for the future, as if there's always going to be a future for us, when in fact there's not. At some point, this life is going to end, and yet we still have all these plans, what we're going to do, uh, what vacation we're going to take, what we're going to do when we get all this money that we're working so hard to get, and all this kind of stuff. The way we view our future is as if it's goes on infinitely into the horizon. Whereas the way the Buddha described it, it was more like a train is headed towards you quickly. So he said, everybody dies. Um, Nobody escapes it. He said, even the gods, when their good karma is exhausted, they die and will be reborn. Who knows? Depending on whatever karma ripens, whatever impetus from some action that was undertaken, influenced by the illusion of conceiving of how oneself and others exist. And one of those imprints ripens, whether it was an action that was done virtuously and would bring about happiness, or non-virtuously and would bring about pain. Even gods could take a lower rebirth. So, like that. And nothing will help unless one is able to get rid of that ignorance through cultivating wisdom. So, and that impermanence is a characteristic that takes place all the time. It's not as if we're permanent until some cause changes us. If our nature was permanent, then nothing could change us, because that's what permanent means. So, in fact, we're always in a state of flux. It's subtle, but we can be aware of it. We know, for instance, like atoms and so on are moving all the time. Atoms are just, subatomic particles that have attraction or repulsion, depending upon positive and negative, right? Moving around all the time, changing all the time, coming into existence, going out of existence. That, that's us all the time. And death is just a gross change that takes place. So, and then, so sufferings, there's different kinds of pains that we experience. Just when the suffering of pain is one suffering. That's an obvious one. The suffering of change is not so obvious, because that's sensual pleasures. How can how can sensual pleasure be considered a suffering? Whatever you call it, suffering of change. How can pleasure be a suffering? Well, because it ends. And when it ends, that's disappointing. And also, what we're doing in order to experience that pleasure, if we do it too much, it becomes painful, such as eating good food. Recently, we had, holiday feasts, so we know that. A little bit more turkey, please? No. So, so many things like going outside in the sun because it's cold in the shade and can't stay in the sun too long because then it gets too hot. Um, Sitting down because one's tired of standing and then having to stand up because one's knees start to hurt or something becomes uncomfortable like that. Even these pleasures, just the very fact, they're based on this body that is very, very difficult to say is in the nature of happiness because it's one way or another, it's so difficult, just to find the means of staying alive, food, clothing, shelter, medicine, education, all of that is difficult, right? I mean, people wouldn't pay us money if our jobs were easy. So it's all difficult. And having to get up when you don't want to get up, and going to sleep and staying in bed, and then not wanting to stay in bed any longer. One looks at the bed in two different, I want to go back to sleep. No, I don't. That's the suffering of change. And then there's a suffering called pervasive suffering, and that's just the fact that having this kind of a body mind complex is right now, it might feel kind of neutral. One is not neither attached to something or repulsed to something else, but any moment that could change. That's the pervasive suffering. Any moment that could change. Any moment, my knees are going to start aching. Any moment, I'm going to, yeah, either a pleasurable experience which changes and then a painful experience arises. Any moment that can happen because of this kind of body and mind that we have. And also sometimes, we look at our bodies as if it's something so pure. And you know, I could look at my daughter and say, "You look great. Why are you putting makeup on?" And she learned from her mother at a very early age, how to put makeup on, and then on the window ledge by the shower, there's almost no room to put my own soap. It's covered, with all kinds of oils and special things for the hair and so on and so forth. And, you know, but even that's proof that the body is not so pure if you have to have all of these things to protect it and try to keep the skin from going gray or getting wrinkled or getting dry, all these things. And really not so pure. Some meditators, they'll meditate on all of the gross substances of the body in order to overcome attachment to it. So I'm not going to go into the details. I'm sure you can all imagine gross substances in the body, so like that. So not so pure, but that's what we have, and we develop, you know, mental tools to make the best of it, right? To make the best of it. Oh, look in the mirror. Not so bad. Maybe if I can just put this colic down a little bit, something not so bad. Could be worse. Things like that. We have these little mental tools that we use to try to just, make the best of things. But nonetheless, it's something to not be so attached to. And if there's a way to escape such a condition in the future, wouldn't it be better? If there's a way to escape this, and then viewing oneself, who's the one that wants to escape and what does it look like? It's not the body because, I refer to the body as something that I possess. My body, you know, I wish I was taller. It's not the body thinking of the body. It's myself thinking of the body, wanting to be this way or that way. It's a possession of mine. Am I the mind? Once again, we refer to the mind as a possession. My mind. I'm intelligent. I have intelligence. It's a possession. But does this person, this I, personal identity exist as an independent entity of the body and the mind? Because surely if it did, one would be able to see it, right? But you don't see it independently of the body and the mind, right? I have, weight, I have height because the body has weight and the body has height. So I'm just using or identifying on the basis of characteristics of the body. Or I'm intelligent, or I wish I was more intelligent. Things like this is one is identifying characteristics of the mind that, and on the basis of those, one generates a personal identity, thinking I or me. So it's not existing independently of the body and the mind. And it's not an entity in the body. If it was, we'd be able to see it. There's no organ that's me separate from all the other organs of the body. There's not one of the organs that is me. No? One of those organs, like my heart, that means it's the possession of mine. My brain, it's possession. There's not a me that can be found there. And at the time of the Buddha, there were existing religions, and those religions had philosophies because uh, the people who founded those religions and practiced deeply those religions, they were interested in what moves from life to life like that. So they would have ideas about what this personal identity is. And one of those views was that the real person is something that is permanent, uh, exists independently of the body and the mind, and is a single thing, not made of parts. And that at the time of death, that would leave and then go someplace else or enter into another womb and be conceived and so on. And so in some religions, they would say this is the hidden real me. And then there's the me that is created by words and thoughts on the basis of actions or form of the body and the mind, like that. That's kind of the false me. But the Buddha pointed out, well, if you look for that permanent, independent, heartless me, you can't find it. It's not there at all. It's just some belief that you've acquired by studying some, other teachings. The real problem is how you see yourself in an everyday way and is the one that is engaged in different actions. How do you see that one? And so then he taught this, his teaching became famous for teaching selflessness in the sense that the way in which we see ourselves is generally as some concrete entity that is not a creation of words and thought. We can imagine things real easy, like Harry Potter. That's a creation of words and thoughts, right? How can I be a creation of words and thought? Well, because I'm thinking I on the basis of an actual body. There's no actual body for Harry Potter. But there's still, even though there's an actual body here, this I, this personal identity, is a creation of words and thought, and therefore it's a subjectively created. It's not concretely existing as an object that appears to my mind through the force of its existence. It's a creation of one's mind, and that's how it appears. But then we kind of add this, I don't know, we just get used to the idea of me as being more concrete than that, not just a mere creation of words. But the Buddha, encouraged his disciples to watch how they appear. Sometimes it'll be just the word, me, I. But of course, the word isn't me. Or sometimes this I will seem to have a shape, but isn't that shape derived from the body? Or maybe some dream about what one would like to look like, or maybe it's an actual dream, a dream body, and then one identifies with that. So he said, that's the I is not this concrete entity. So that was the truth of suffering. Then, if suffering has no cause and it just comes into existence by itself, then how would you get rid of it? So he said there is a cause or an origin of this suffering, and he said it is ignorance, this misconception of how we view ourselves, and actions that we take based upon that view. And such actions are called karma. Karma is a Sanskrit word, it means action, and not just any action, it's intentional action. Uh, Intentional action of the mind and the intended action of the body and speech. And that leaves an imprint in the mind, every action that we engage in that's intentional. Unconscious actions that we do don't leave such an impression, but intentional actions leave an impression in the mind. And that's what causes one to take a rebirth. So the truth of that eliminates the wrong view that there is no cause or origin to the suffering. The truth of that is that there's nothing outside ourselves that causes one to take this round of birth and death and rebirth and death and so on, this vicious circle. There's nobody else that's doing that. That this is this subtle activity that takes place in our everyday thoughts and activities is enough, powerful enough to create a rebirth. It doesn't require a powerful God to cause us to take rebirth. We do it ourselves. So then it's up to us to do something about it. And can something be done? And that's where the truth of cessation comes in. If one can cease that ignorance, then one can cease engaging in the type of actions that are take place on the basis of that misconception of one's reality, that ignorance, and then one can become free of taking rebirth and that experience. Um, when you eliminate a wrong view with such a wisdom, it stays eliminated, doesn't come back again, and that is very peaceful experience, very satisfying experience, and so it never goes away. And then he taught the path leading to cessation, because it's one thing to talk about cessation and imagine how wonderful it could possibly be, but if there's no way to achieve it, then that's just a dream. So he taught the path leading to cessation, and that was cultivating uh, the right view, which is to see um, things the way they actually exist, in such a way that will directly act as a direct antidote to the misconception that misconceives how things exist. So what he instructed his students to meditate on would be the mere absence of the illusory person. So there's the person that exists, and that's something that appears to the mind based upon some basis, like the body or the mind, and then the thought thinking me or I on the basis of the body and the mind. That's what is actually existing. So it's something that only has kind of a customary existence, the custom of how we use language. And we learn uh, pronouns such as I and me, and we learn how to use them in sentences and when it's appropriate to use them. So I'm sitting here because the body is in the sitting position and my mind is thinking I, like that. That's what actually exists. The illusory I is when you take that I and then think that it's has its own objective existence, independent of that process that I just described. And when one discovers that that doesn't really exist, then one sees a mere absence of that, and that's what one focuses on. So the mere absence of that is a direct antidote to the conception or the thought, thinking of this concrete I. You can't have both functioning at the same time. Just like you can't have hot and cold water. It's either hot or it's cold. It's not hot and cold. Or is a classic example that an owl and a crow can't occupy the same tree at the same time. They're enemies of each other. So when I read that, I had no idea what they were talking about. And then one time I was living in England, I actually saw an owl and a crow fighting. The crow, yeah, because the owl steals the crow's eggs, and so the crow fights against the owl. So they're like that. So similarly, this the right idea, the right view that sees a mere absence of the concrete self is a direct antidote to the misconception that holds a concrete self. Okay, so the stronger that one gets, the weaker the other one gets. So if you have cold water in the sink and you run hot water into it, eventually gets less cold, warm, hot, like that. So similarly, as one cultivates this right view, then the wrong view gets weaker and weaker until one can completely abandon it. And that's abandoned with one cultivates a very strong concentration and the ability within that state of concentration to analyze this person to see how it's empty of this concretely existing. And through that combination of a subtle analysis and powerful concentration, one can go beyond an intellectual or a conceptual understanding and gain a direct experience. Because eventually the conceptual mind cannot satisfy with kind of images of what one is trying to understand. One has to actually perceive the thing directly. So one gets a direct experience of this ultimate reality, and that one begins to then abandon this this misconception. The first time one gets the direct experience is called the path of seeing, and then one continues with the meditation practice, And when uh, abandons that misconception, subtler and subtler and subtler levels of that misconception, that's called the path of meditation, until one arrives at what's called the path of no more learning. And that's where one achieves liberation from the cycle of death and rebirth, because one is abandoned forevermore that ignorance that is the root of of, of the problem. So that's what the Buddha that's what the Buddha's first teaching, and he taught for 40 years. So he taught all kinds of people. He taught founders of other uh, spiritual traditions. He taught kings and queens. He taught merchants. He taught farmers. He taught beggars. The, no, there was no class distinction in his mind. He taught everyone, and he taught according to what would help them. He didn't teach to like spread his unique teaching. He taught what would help them. There's even examples of where he assured a group of people that the concrete self existed. So he even taught opposite to the thing that he discovered, because if uh, if if you taught them the emptiness of a concrete self, the lack of the concrete self, they would then think that there would be no basis um, for, there would be nothing that would go from life to life. And therefore, there would be no reason to practice moral discipline. And, 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 and if they didn't have a reason to practice moral discipline, in his mind, he would see that then they would accumulate causes for taking lower rebirths and suffering in the future. So he told them, yes, there is a concrete self, and then he gave them these other things to do. And after a while, the idea was that their intelligence, their mind would open up to the possibility of it not being as concrete as they had believed, that there could still be uh, a way of existing without that concrete self, and that there would still be a basis upon which to practice a moral discipline. If not to achieve a higher rebirth, then it would be to achieve deeper states of concentration. Because I don't know, I suppose we all know what the term pangs of conscience are, when you remember something and you kind of hit yourself. A pang of conscience, right? That that's one of the biggest disturbances for developing single-pointed concentration, because you immediately forget what you're meditating on, and then you're thinking about this. Oh, how could I have done that? Things like that. So the Buddha recommended the practice of moral discipline uh, to avoid engaging in actions that will disturb the mind. And as you get deeper into your concentration, you you start to, subtle things, subtle thoughts will become more obvious to you. And so things that one might be trying to avoid thinking about will suddenly appear. And so if you practice a good moral discipline, you won't be engaged in negative actions that will become such a distraction to oneself. So, yeah, he taught for 40 years all kinds of beings. And, and initially, the teachings were memorized and passed on through an oral tradition. And after a few hundred years, they started to write it down. I think it might have been harder to find people who could memorize those teachings. After the Buddha passed away, there was a council, and all of his students gathered together, and his attendant Ananda, sat down. They all his his uh, his his monks, they took off one of their robes and laid it down and made a nice soft seat, and Ananda sat on that seat. And Ananda was with the Buddha almost on all occasions. And so he heard all of these teachings of the Buddha, and so he recited them. And these the attendants, all these monks, many of which had achieved liberation and had, powerful concentration and ability to memorize, they heard all of those teachings, and then they would pass that on to their students like that. And yeah, the tradition of the discipline that the monks held, the main talks that the Buddha gave, different um, what would you call it? The definitions of different terms. That was those were recited like that. So the teachings were preserved initially through memorization, and then they had to be written down. So and some of those teachings they're available and you can read and you can understand. There are others that are really difficult to understand. And so later generations of scholars, Buddhist scholars, would write commentaries to try to bring out those meanings. And yeah, because some meanings were explicit, but still difficult to understand. And so that had to be commentaries written about that. Some meanings were interpretable. And so one had to try to find what the Buddha, what his intention was behind saying the things that he said. Like when I described how he taught a group of people that there was a concrete self, and then I described what his intention was behind teaching that. So there are other teachings that he taught like that. So that had to be elucidated through commentaries. And as cultures change and words that might have had a powerful impact in the past no longer were used. So then commentaries had to be created with the kind of terms that were more meaningful. And as the teachings would move to different cultures and different languages, then more commentaries. But there's lots of teachings of the Buddha that are existing now. And so the teachings fall into kind of two broad categories called the individual vehicle and the universal vehicle. Uh, Different translations of Sanskrit terms called Hinayana and Mahayana. Hinayana is the individual vehicle, and Mahayana is the universal vehicle. So the Hinayana is characterized by trying to achieve liberation as quickly as possible, and and the teachings are there, and everybody's responsible for their own liberation, and so get it as quickly as you can, kind of thing. And universal vehicle is more like liberation would be great to have right now, but then I would be in a state where I wouldn't be able to teach anybody. And I couldn't bear that because it would be like waking up in the middle of the night and finding out that the house is on fire and running out the door and not alerting the rest of my family that the house is on fire. So in the universal vehicle, it's called universal because it's a vehicle, because it's a really big vehicle that everybody can get in, as opposed to a small vehicle where just I'm in, like that. So the universal vehicle teachings. So Tibet was right next to India, and There was a great king in Tibet who Song Songsangampo, I think Songsangampo, I think was his name, and he had a wife from China because the Chinese emperor wanted to not have this warlord bothering his kingdom. The king of Nepal offered his daughter to that Tibetan king, so he was very powerful. And once he had settled on the borders and he had control over his enemies, he had to then rule over the people. And the Tibetans at that time were kind of infamous. In India, they were referred to as the most barbaric. There was no point in trying to teach Buddhism to them. But this king, he thought, I have to have something to kind of control these people. So he thought a good religion would be suitable, and so he had his prime minister go down to India and learn Sanskrit and develop a Tibetan written language to be able to translate the teachings existing in India. And that translator went to Nalanda Monastery, which is a great place of learning in India, and studied Buddhism, and then generations of translators and scholars went to India. Not a lot because it's a difficult climate for Tibetans, but the great translators did, and then they brought back um, text and brought back scholars, Indian scholars, and they would bring them back to Tibet, and you would have an Indian scholar, an Indian who knew Sanskrit and had learned some Tibetan, a Tibetan who had learned Sanskrit, and like that, and they would sit down and work out these translations. There's even an effort today of translating texts from the Tibetan back to Sanskrit because so many of the Sanskrit texts were lost. So, so that and the Tibetans were interested mainly in the universal vehicle, but all the teachings of the Buddha, and then it just depended upon the particular interest of the translator, and then they would translate as many texts, and then they are existing in Tibet, and that tradition had become very strong. So for 1,000 years, they were able to preserve their culture and the tradition of practicing Buddhism without being disturbed. And then, of course, the great diaspora happened, and so now we have access to those teachings. There was some advantage to that diaspora, but of course the Tibetans might argue with that. But there is an advantage because now we have the ability to study those things. So there's a few minutes left. If anybody has any questions, I may have said something that was unclear or something that was uncomfortable to hear. I'd like to have a chance to correct any mistake I may have made, like that. Anything coming from the land of Zoom? Okay. Yes. Could you speak into the microphone?
Of the Dalai Lama fit into this history?
Um, well, that was a result of a Mongolian warlord, and so he wanted to have also some control over Tibet, And to have control over Tibet, you had to have somebody that the Tibetans could respect. And so there was this one highly revered uh, scholar and practitioner in one of the great Gelug monasteries in central Tibet. And so that warlord appointed him to be the king of Tibet, like that. So that and that and the Mongolians referred to him with a Mongolian name, Dalai Lama. The Dalai, like the ocean, is the ocean of knowledge and wisdom, and the Lama is the Tibetan term, which is the same. It's the translation of the word guru, right? So, but Dalai is a Mongolian term, and so that became a tradition, initially maintained through this Mongolian army, and then it, as it became more organized, it continued through the Tibetan organization. Mongolians, after a while, lost, their ability to control Tibet, but Tibetans would still send great lamas to teach in Mongolia, like that. So they had a strong relationship, friendly relationship. But then it was, self-governed after a while, till you had like the fifth Dalai Lama. Today, the current Dalai Lama is the 14th, but the fifth, he had such was so powerful that he could build the Patala Palace, which is quite a construction. Must have been very expensive to do that. He even he knew he was going to die before it was completed. And he had his prime minister, or is it could be attendant, very powerful person anyway, because he was the attendant, to not tell anybody when he died, to ensure that the patala would be finished. But in any case, it was a tradition that was able to continue for a while. And like some Dalai Lamas didn't live very long for whatever reason. And then others did live longer, like the 13th Dalai Lama. He lived to a good age, but he told his ministers and the heads of the great monasteries that if they didn't follow this plan that he had laid out, that he would have to die soon, because the Tibet would need um, a leader to lead them when something hits the fan. So he could have lived longer, but then the 14th Dalai Lama came about, and during the time of when Mao Zedong decided that he wanted Tibet. So we've run out of time, and thank you for coming. And if you've heard anything that could be useful to you, then try not to forget it. There is a practice that when one finishes, when a teaching is over with, one tries to recall whatever was said. If one can't recall everything that was said, then recall what was the most meaningful, or what was most meaningful to yourself, to recall that. And then of the night of that teaching, try to recall what one was able to recall earlier before one goes to bed. And then the following morning, if you can still recall anything, then that will probably stay with you. So do your best, and we'll be meeting here next Sunday, same time, same station. Yeah, thank you.